the last speaker for today. Oh, I know. It always comes to an end. Fun times always pass way too fast. But we welcome here Kurt Baumgartner, an old friend of mine, an old friend of ours actually, who's a researcher and co-founder of a new company called TLP Black. I think the first time we met Kurt was back in 2019 at a very interesting conference. Was not in Belgium, but we did have a lot of beers. So, those pre-COVID times, they were good, they were nice. Now, every time, and this is for everybody to listen to, every time I talk to Kurt or he just presents something new, I'm always at all. And I mean, we try to follow new threads every day, but there's always something that apparently he finds that nobody else does. So I'm really looking forward to this presentation. And today he will actually enrich us with research that he's done on ORB networks, or otherwise known as operational relay box networks, something that we've also observed in 2025 as it is being used by multiple China Nexus actors. But I'm sure we'll learn something new here. Welcome to the QCTR stage and have fun giving your ORB reflections and a research presentation, Kurt. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kevin. It's great to see you again. Hopefully we can have some beers in Belgium sometime too. Today I'm here to talk about ORB reflections and research. Hopefully I can live up to that introduction, very kind of you. And everybody walks away with at least a little bit of something new in relation to ORB networks. First of all, a little bit about me. I've spent the past 15 years working for an international team as a part of an international team for an international cybersecurity company. We were well known for APT hunting research, and now I'm a part of TLP Black, and we perform a number of things related to APT hunting, discovery, monitoring, and research. Today, for the next 30 minutes, I would like to go over ORB networks, a brief reintroduction, and I'll explain what I mean by a reintroduction in just a little bit. That first came out in 2024 when Mandiant's, when Michael Raggi of Mandiant Google Cloud reintroduced the concept of ORB and a framework around it, a very specific framework. And I want to briefly go over a history of the term, some reflections of what was going on in 2025, and then what we expect to see in 2026, which would include some tangential research, I think, related to anonymization networks in general. So first off, the 2024 ORB reintroduction and a little bit of discussion about the term itself. So if you don't know, I'm assuming for the most part, a lot of you already know a bit about operational relay box networks, but within the framework introduced by Mandiant in 2024, an ORB network is a proxy network, and it's a mesh network that facilitates covert cyber operations. It can be very complex, or it can be fairly flat. They give, Michael Raggi in his presentation gives several examples. ORB3 would be an example of a very flat ORB network, and something like ORB2 would be an example of a rather complex network with node relays and a very strong or very global mesh supporting the network. So this reintroduction, what did this ORB framework really address? I believe it is scoped. There's a pretty severe scoping, limiting the framework to China Nexus activity. Somewhat strange, because in the presentation he does acknowledge that there are Russian actors, Iranian actors, there are all sorts of actors, or I should say actors from all over the world that are using something like an orb network, but they don't fit under this specific framework. And it may have something to do with the sort of explosion of orb network activity that is related to China nexus groups, but it has a pretty severe scope. The framework addresses the incomplete nature of terms that he feels are bandied about. So simply calling it a proxy network, a botnet, or offering up network IOCs related to these orb networks doesn't fully encapsulate the complexity and the true nature of these mesh networks. And we'll get into exactly what those are in just a little bit. He wants to address the massive scale and the complexity of these networks. And the scale here is something that is notable. In the next few slides, we'll look at exactly how large some of these networks have gotten compared to even a decade ago. This is a long-standing problem. So in 2016, the Chinese SSF reorganized, and Mandiant claims that there was sort of a big bang of commercialized sustainable entities that are now supporting these orb networks and maintaining these orb networks. And then finally, there is a need to unify the discussion itself to identify what we're defending against and to properly address the problem. Now, an interesting thing is being introduced here, that we enumerate these orb resources as orb 1, orb 2, orb 3, and of course other organizations and other defenders are not necessarily picking that up. They're calling them covert network 1658. I think that's Microsoft's moniker for Quad 7. And so we aren't necessarily having a unified discussion here, but the framework is there. One interesting thing and kind of unusual thing about this nomenclature is that with APTs, we have APTs from all over the world: Russian, North Korean, Iranian, you name it. And then with this particular phenomenon, again, the scope is limited to a truly Asian Pacific phenomenon. So we're not calling it an APT phenomenon, we're calling it orb 1, orb 2, orb 3, even though it truly is an Asian Pacific threat. So that's a little strange here. The naming can be a little odd, but it seems like a very useful and a nice framework. If you haven't had a chance to watch his presentation, I include a link to it here. It's fantastic. It goes through not only the framework itself, but hunting and specific use cases. It's excellent. I had an opportunity when he presented here in Denver at NWISE to attend it, and it was great. I was very fortunate. There are some complications that this framework addresses, and essentially it comes down to the dynamic nature and the temporality, the multiple use nature of each orb. So you may have one actor that's building out their orb network and using it themselves while they're selling access to it or providing access to it to multiple other actors. So it becomes very difficult for defenders to understand exactly who is attacking them in any one given moment if they aren't fully tracking and keeping an updated model of these orb networks. And then finally, the ephemerality of these networks. How long are these data points remaining a part of this particular orb, and can they change over time? We've seen that with Iron Husky and other sorts of APT, where if you're looking at a specific IP address, it may be that host may be changed and used by another actor the next day. So with that sort of dynamic nature, that's something we have to address, and these complications are best addressed with this orb framework. So having said that, in 2024, this orb framework was reintroduced. Let's briefly look at a history of the term orb because it does go back quite a ways. It's a special term, and we do see it popping up in some slides that were leaked online. These public slides were not likely the non-Snowden slides that were leaked, and they refer to 2010 orbs that have nothing to do with China. There's no China nexus here. But what's interesting about the slides is back in 2010, they're describing their use as a covert infrastructure that confounds attribution. The use cases have to do with exploitation and exfiltration. Some of the slides that are publicly available describe mass efforts to identify or to discover targets and come up with a list of simply 3,000 potential orbs. You compare that to some of the recent reporting regarding Flax Typhoon. The FBI came out and said that they were aware of 1.2 million nodes that were compromised and used as a part of this orb network. So when you compare the orb activity of long ago, it would take 8 teams of 3 network analysts a day to come up with 3,000 potential orbs. And here you have today orb networks that are cycling through 1.2 million nodes, and at any one time have an active list of 250,000 nodes. You have a much larger problem on your hands today than you did over a decade ago. Some of the things that also came up were simply that Nmap at the time was being used as a port scanning tool to enable and support target discovery. So, okay, the term is over a decade old. What's changed since then? Certainly, there are capable contractors. There are publicly traded companies, allegedly, performing this activity. There have been indictments, there have been sanctions, but again, there are publicly traded companies performing this work on behalf of other organizations. There's improved hardware, software services. So not only ZMAP and ZGraph are available to perform scans at scale, but there are a number of services, publicly available services, that provide all sorts of data about individual hosts for you. In the US, a lot of people use Shodan. It will provide you with data about a specific host, vulnerabilities that host may provide, attack surface around the globe that can be queried. There are APIs for this, so that when proof of concept arrives, there's all this attack surface that's available and known. In China, there are Shodan equivalents. FOFA and Zumai are available, which were not available years ago. And additionally, there's been an absolute explosion in attack surface around the world. IoT devices, end-of-life routers, unpatched devices that are simply that are not end-of-life, but residential network owners just haven't gotten around to patching them, or businesses that haven't, patched their devices. So it's a huge problem, and it is ongoing. Open source availability has certainly accelerated. Mirai source code floated around. A lot of these end-day exploits that are being used to compromise and create what are called non-provisioned nodes, which are simply compromised IoT or router devices, are readily available. The Tor browser or Tor source, along with proxies, router exploit, all of this is fully available online, and sort of the seeds of the concept has been leaked, and there's been over a decade of this global orb activity to set the example, to set the stage, essentially. So in the decade, okay, it's been over a decade. What has remained the same? There have been a couple of things. Nmap style utilities continue to be used to identify hosts and attack surface. And the attack surface continues to be routing devices, and firewalls. Network edge devices are consistently and routinely attacked to provide support for these mesh networks. So as we're looking back at 2025, I realize the scope of the presentation has to focus on Q4 in particular. Let's just look back at 2025 a bit and the biggest ORB reports. So since that 2024 presentation, there's been quite a bit of research that has been released. And here is my obligatory, it is 2026, here's my obligatory AI related slide. I asked Claude to tell me a little bit about the major releases since 2024. And Claude let me know there have been 9 major public reports. Not all of them have been in 2025. And of course, to me, the most significant was the Raptor Trainer report, which Claude managed to forget about. So I asked Claude to review that, and Claude reminded me that, oh yeah, I missed that one. So AI certainly is aiding my research here in its own way. In 2025, there were a number of releases, research releases that are significant that have activity that are ongoing. That's sort of the most interesting piece of this slide. Here we have, a half dozen research reports. When you look at Polar Edge, when you look at lapdogs, the same nodes continue to be active even today. Moving into Q4, at least the reported activity in Q4 had to do with Bulbature. Now, Bulbature and its orb have to do with orb 1, which has to do with Gobrat, reported back in 2016, and may have something to do with Red Relay, a VPN network that was publicly discussed by PwC back in 2023, I believe. So of these research reports, the Q4 activity that I would like to discuss in particular have to do with something that's somewhat newish. Cisco Talos released a report on UAT 7290, and they included some coverage of Bulbature and a particular certificate that was used to communicate with Bulbature C2 in late 2025. So let's dive into that a little bit. First off, it's an excellent blog post. If you haven't seen it over on the Talos site, UAT 7290 is, according to them, a new group. It's at least a new tag for a group that they trace back going to 2022. The primary targets have to do with South Asian telecoms, although they're seeing a spread of activity into Southeastern Europe, which is really interesting. They discuss a sort of a dual role for this actor, for this group, providing both espionage, cyber espionage of their own, but becoming an initial access provider for this ORB network. It's still being hammered out exactly how if they're maintaining this orb themselves, or if they're just providing compromised devices for this orb to be maintained by someone else. It's a little gray area for me, and there's no mention of Gobrat. So when in a little bit, I'll talk about the overlap between Bulbature and Gobrat, but they trace this group to 2022, and Gobrat certainly has a history prior to that. And yeah, there's just a little confusion here on my part about uh, exactly how far back this group goes and their involvement in running this orb. The group itself is not terribly sophisticated. They don't have an exploit factory like the Pacific Rim guys did. They rely on public POC, which is interesting in itself. The Talos claims that they have strong overlap with Red Foxtrot. And this is a little odd because that group goes back a long ways. The reporting came out, I believe, in 2021 and recorded future associated the resources and activity, all the TTPs, to a PLA group SSF unit in their public reporting years ago. So again, I'm not sure where the lines, fully are delineated here for this group. But let's dive a little more into the Bulbature infrastructure and what Talos is talking about here. So they identify a particular certificate that's being used by the implants and on the C2 in that are hosted within two networks, mostly in China and Hong Kong. They provide a SHA-256 fingerprint for the certificate. And if you look back, at least in our data, we do see some overlap with Gobrat, Supershell, and Cobalt Strike for these C2, which is interesting in itself. At the same time, there's another certificate that helps us identify Gobrat admin servers, and there are more than 24 of those C2 in Hong Kong. And four of those hosts match Sequoia reporting from 2023. So there's a lot of overlap here that continues to happen. To me, it looks like there are separate clusters of Bulbature C2, and there are separate clusters of Gobrat admin hosts, but they all overlap in some way. They are mostly being maintained in Hong Kong and China, and there aren't any samples that have any callbacks recently being shared on VT. So these guys have become more sophisticated, and the hosts are moving around. They are setting up new boxes, taking some down. There were, at the time of reporting, I believe it was 128 in early January, 128 Bulbature C2 related to this activity. But if you examine the data now, around 24 of those servers have been taken down, and I'm sure they'll pop up elsewhere. They'll pop up again, possibly with new certificates. But the point here is the group is active. They're actively maintaining new C2, new admin consoles, and there are incremental steps that we're seeing with this infrastructure, and it all continues to overlap. We see updates and additional functionality on multiple servers. I included an interesting IP address here that includes several different bits of functionality that aren't provided on some of the other Gobrat admin C2. There's UDP functionality that's being included at this C2. So there, in all likelihood, there's a newer bot that this C2 is managing and providing command and control for. And if you're looking for data regarding crossover, and you're trying to see and you're trying to understand where things may cross over between Gobrat admin and Bulbature C2, I included two IP addresses for researchers to move forward with that provide some interesting overlap between the two disparate technologies that these groups are using. And then finally, one notable thing, I want to kind of pivot away from um, specific orb talk because we're looking at 2026 and what's coming. Um, their anonymization networks are sort of tangential to orb networks, and these include residential proxy networks. They can be um, they can be compromised, but they can also be provided by the owner of that router device. They can be providing these proxies knowingly, but not knowing the data transiting their proxy. We've seen private APT using residential private or proxy networks, known ones that you can pay for. They use it for covert information gathering, and we've seen activity being addressed by major social networks throughout 2025 that have real-world ramifications that are really pretty severe. And we expect to see more of that in 2026. So yes, we will continue seeing orb networks. We will continue seeing build out and support for them. But I believe we will see more of these paid networks and APT actors who may not have the resources to maintain a 1.2 million node effort or maintain 250,000 active nodes in their orb networks. They're going to turn to these residential proxy networks, and we'll see more covert information gathering from them. So leading into 2026, what we've seen is that research exposures do not force major changes. Yes, the groups are incrementally changing their infrastructure and changing their orb node implants, but there aren't major changes that we've seen. End of life and unpatched devices will continue to provide plenty of material for these actors to attack and abuse. These orbs will continue to exist until we see Raptor train equivalent disruption from government or otherwise or other organizations. They are not being ripped down. In one case, yeah, with APT 31, I believe we saw some true disruption there, but these orb networks are resilient. And then we're going to, again, see actors spread out to residential proxy and private VPN networks. We've seen VPN networks used by actors in the past. On FRAC, for example, we saw a particular actor using SuperJumper, and I believe we will see more research being presented on this type of activity leading into 2026. So more orb tangential research in addition to the orb activity that we've been seeing throughout 2025. And finally, I just want to leave you with a couple, what presentation would be worthwhile without a couple interesting IOCs included in the slides. So I thank you for your time, and I look forward to seeing more orb research in 2026. Thank you, Kevin.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Kurt. Again, interesting presentation, as we've seen so many of them today. Before we go into the closing thoughts, there is one question that I've seen here from Brent. Basically says, how can you realistically defend yourself against attacks via orb networks?
Yeah, so defense is you got to add some level of context to that sort of question. So there's small, mid, large size networks that are defending themselves against actors abusing orb networks. There's many different approaches that organizations can take to defend themselves. I mean, really, the covert activity, if you're defending yourself against Chinese APT, you're aware of how persistent and already that you need to be looking out for spear phishing. And really the confounding factor here is the attribution is going to be confused at first. And there are going to be, it's going to be very difficult to see infrastructure that may be used once there's a compromise. And it may be difficult to identify where these are coming from because it will change over the course of time. So, you know, you're still defending yourself from APT, but now there's a new factor. You need to keep up and keep on top of where these attacks may be coming from, and you need to be able to identify these exit nodes coming from residential networks and unexpected places. Now, I've seen large like social networks that deal with these actors by limiting sort of visibility that these actors may have into their content. I've seen other organizations simply deal with it as an APT problem that they've had all along. But certainly the attribution is a confounding factor here. So intelligence, really, you need to dive into monitoring and tracking these dynamic resources, these org networks.
Yep. So keep on researching and keep on sharing with everyone, I would say. Thank you very much, Kurt.
All right. Thank you.